Good morning, dudes. Hope your weekend went well. I think we're ready to make our first couple of cuts with our table saw. We got it set up in the last video. And I'm going to just double check. Got the blade up. Nice and straight. So I mentioned last time that I seldom use the little square that comes with the saw. As a matter of fact, when I bought the saw, this metal was so tight that it wouldn't even move through the saw. And I suppose a lot of people would freak out and take it right back. But actually I was thrilled because that meant that I could plane this down a little bit. I could sand it down and make a nice snug fit. The worst thing in the world on this little T-square is to have it banging around inside the slot, which means that the angle of your wood is changing. So I was actually thrilled that this was a little bit too big and I had to adjust it. Okay, so until you have some sort of a sled or other mechanism, you are going to have to use this. The nice thing is it quickly changes its angle. That's also very bad because it can get out of whack really easily as well. And it's very short. It just doesn't give you much leverage to control the piece of wood. But in any case, we need to have it 90 degrees to make a straight cut. So let's just check that really quick. Get it set up. Make sure our combination square is not hitting the teeth on the blade. It's hitting the actual blade itself. This squared up. Okay, and then to make this even more useful, you can get a piece of scrap and actually drill. This one has holes already drilled out. You can mount a larger board on this thing and give yourself a little more use out of it until you get something a little bit bigger. Okay, so that's the square and how that goes. Well, I think we're ready to make our first cut. So I've got a piece of wood here that's hanging around. We'll just use this as an example. It's got some rough edges on it. I'm not so sure if it's square or not, but I really don't care at this point. So let's just say we want something, a piece of wood that's 8 inches by 6 inches. Okay, so it's going to be slightly rectangular, 8 inches by 6 inches. So take a little dust off the saw. First thing we're going to do is we're going to oversize our piece of wood, and that allows me to trim it up on both sides. Okay, so I'm going to set my fence up for 9 inches. And I set it up on the little bar across here, but I'm just going to double check. 9 and 9 for the tooth. I'm going to raise the blade down. The blade should stick out above the work, but not too much for normal cuts. So my first cut is going to be 9 inches, and that'll give me some room that I can flip it over and make a second cut. Okay? Be sure to protect your eyes and your fingers and your ears and your lungs and all that good stuff. So here we go. Okay, notice that I'm not in a hurry when I cut. I'm not trying to force the wood through the saw. I don't try to draw the wood back, and I resist the temptation to go through and pick these pieces of wood away from the blade while it's still spinning. So we'll remove this, slide this out. So that should be a pretty good edge here. So it came through the saw like this. So now I'm going to flip it over. And now we can do our real dimension, which is 8 inches. Okay, so let's make that second cut. The blade doesn't need any help cutting, so you really don't have to watch this blade all the time. Your concern is keeping this work against the fence, front and back. As soon as this piece of wood starts to wobble going through here, now you're going to get a terrible cut. So once you know your fingers are out of the way and everything is safe, I keep my eye right through here. I want to keep that piece of wood tight against the fence, okay? And again, don't try to draw it back through the saw. If there's any variation in your blade, you can catch it and it can toss it back at you. Okay, so we wanted 8 by 6. So now I'm going to set it up for 7 inches, and we're going to flip it around. Let's flip it the other way. All right. And now we can flip it this way and get our final 6 inches. Alrighty, so let's just check our board for a second. It looks like we're nice and square on our corners. That's good, that's good. That's all good. And we'll check the actual cut itself. That looks good, nice and straight, a good 90 on there. That's important because if you're doing cabinet work or something like that, any small error, even a few degrees here on your cut, will be amplified 36 inches away if it's the side of a cabinet. So it's really important to set that saw up and get nice 90-degree cuts. Makes everything else a lot easier. Well, I got to get busy and get some work done today, but one last thing as far as the cuts on the saw. There are cases where your wood is not true when you're starting. I mangled up a piece of wood with the handsaw just to give us an example. So this piece of wood does not have true edges. I don't know if you can see that well on the camera, but I just cut a bunch of angles on the side. And so your first inclination would be that this is unusable. You can't really work with it on the table saw because it's just not safe. And you're not going to be able to get a straight cut. We can see how the grain on the veneer is running this way. So here's a solution that should let you save some of the wood and align it so that we have nice, true parallel sides. So I have a piece of stock here, and let's just make sure that this is nice and parallel. I'm going to set the saw up, and we'll run this through very quickly. Just going to nibble the edge and make sure this is straight. Flip it over, do the same thing. Okay, now I know that piece is parallel. Both sides are perfectly parallel. So we're going to take our crummy piece of wood here. We'll align the grain kind of how we'd like it. And we're going to take this piece of wood here that we just rigged up. We'll drill a couple little holes. And I have a couple of small little screws here. Okay, so we've attached our piece of wood with good parallel edges here, a couple little screws, and let's see if we can save this piece. We'll go to the best edge we've got here, and let's get busy. All right, so we have a nice true edge. We can undo our screws. And now we can send it back through the saw since we have a parallel edge. So we rescued this piece of wood. It should have now two parallel edges, and now we can bring this back into the good pile. Well, time for another coffee, and I got to get to work. I'll see you dudes later. Oh, and dudettes, of course.